The hair had been Maria Josefa's glory since childhood, a cascade of black silk that fell to her knees when unbound. Her mother used to say it was a gift from God, thick as rope and lustrous as the wings of ravens that circled the adobe walls of Santa Fe. Now, in the autumn of 1650, it lay in coils on the floor of Don Rodrigo Salazar's trading post, and Maria stood with her head feeling strange and light, her neck exposed to the cool air for the first time in her 22 years. 5 reales, Don Rodrigo said, not looking at her as he gathered the hair into his gnarled hands. That's generous, considering the times. Maria said nothing. 5 reales would buy bread for a week, perhaps longer if she was careful. Her fingers trembled as she accepted the coins, still warm from the merchant's leather purse. Through the small window, she could see the mountains turning purple in the evening light, the same mountains her father had crossed 3 years ago, promising to return from his trading expedition to the Pueblo villages. He never had. The fever took him somewhere along the Rio Grande, and his body was buried in earth she would never see. "You'll grow it back," Don Rodrigo added, finally meeting her eyes. There was something in his gaze that made her skin crawl, a predatory gleam that had nothing to do with commerce. Hair like that always grows back. Perhaps in a few months, when you're hungry again, we can make another arrangement. She understood his meaning perfectly. The merchant's reputation was well known among the women of Santa Fe. He preferred his transactions to involve more than coin. Maria clutched the reales and fled without another word. Outside, the plaza was nearly empty. Most families were at evening mass, their voices rising in hymns from the small church that Governor Lopez de Mendizabal had ordered renovated just last year. Maria didn't go to church anymore, not since Father Cristobal had suggested that her poverty was a result of insufficient faith, as if God himself had personally decided that Maria Josefa Romero should starve. She hurried through the narrow streets, past the homes of the fortunate, the encomenderos who held land grants, the soldiers who protected the colony, the friars who administered to souls while their bellies stayed full. Her own dwelling was barely more than a hovel, a single room of crumbling adobe that she rented from a widow for 2 reales a month. It had been her parents' home once, before debts had consumed everything. Inside, she lit a candle stub and looked at herself in the fragment of mirror that hung on the wall, a luxury she'd refused to sell only because it had been her mother's. The face that looked back was gaunt, hollow-cheeked, but still recognizably hers. Her hair, though, her beautiful hair, was butchered, uneven, hanging just below her ears in ragged clumps. Don Rodrigo hadn't bothered with care or artistry. He'd simply cut it off as close to the roots as his shears could manage. Maria touched her bare neck and felt something cold settle in her chest. Not grief exactly, not even shame, though she knew the other women would talk, would whisper about what desperation had driven her to such an act. No, what she felt was closer to clarity, a crystallization of understanding that had been forming for months, perhaps years. She was invisible to these people, worthless. A woman alone, with no family, no protection, no prospects for marriage. What did she matter? Don Rodrigo could cheat her, charge her whatever he wished for her own hair. Father Cristobal could lecture her about faith while dining on mutton. The governor's wife could pass her in the street without even seeing her. To them, she was nothing more than a ghost, already dead, just waiting for her body to realize it. But Maria was not dead, and as she stood there in the candlelight, touching the butchered remains of her hair, something hardened inside her like iron in a forge. 5 reales, she whispered to the darkness, for 22 years of growth. The injustice of it burned. Maria began to watch. It started simply enough. She needed to understand the people who had reduced her to this state, needed to see them clearly, without the fog of desperation that had clouded her vision for so long. So she watched, and she listened, and she learned. Don Rodrigo Salazar, she discovered, was not merely a merchant, but a smuggler. He traded with the Pueblo Indians against the governor's explicit orders, exchanging Spanish goods for turquoise, pottery, and other items he could sell for enormous profit in Mexico City. More importantly, he dealt in information. Men came to his trading post not just to buy and sell, but to whisper secrets, to forge alliances, to plot against their enemies. Maria learned this because she began working for him. It happened a week after she'd sold her hair. She'd spent 3 of her 5 reals on cornmeal and beans, and was trying to make the rest last when hunger drove her back to the trading post. She'd hoped to find work elsewhere, anywhere else, but Santa Fe in 1650 offered few opportunities for a woman without connections. The servants' positions were all filled, the weaving work was controlled by the friars, and she lacked the capital to start even the smallest enterprise. Don Rodrigo had smiled when she entered his shop, that same predatory smile she remembered from before. "Back so soon?" he'd said. "Did the money run out already, little sparrow?" She'd forced herself to meet his eyes. "I'm looking for work, Don Rodrigo. Any work you might have." "Work?" He'd drawn the word out, savoring it. "What sort of work could you do, I wonder? Can you read, write, keep accounts?" "Yes," she'd lied, though it wasn't entirely false. Her father had taught her letters before he died, and she could cipher well enough. "Interesting." He'd circled her slowly, appraising her like livestock. "You're thin, but you're not weak. Your hands look capable, and you're desperate, which means you'll be loyal. I might have something for you." The work, as it turned out, was exactly as degrading as she'd feared. She swept his floors, organized his storerooms, and served wine when he entertained certain guests in his back room. But it also placed her at the center of Santa Fe's web of intrigue, and Maria discovered she had a talent for invisibility. Men talked freely in front of her, as if she were no more conscious than a piece of furniture. She learned that Governor Lopez de Mendizabal was involved in a bitter dispute with the Franciscan friars over Indian labor. The governor wanted to use the Pueblo Indians for public works and personal enrichment, while the friars insisted the Indians should work only for the missions. The conflict had grown so heated that both sides were sending letters to the Inquisition in Mexico City, each accusing the other of heresy and corruption. She learned that Don Rodrigo was playing both sides, selling information to the governor, while also trading contraband with the friars, who needed certain luxuries they couldn't officially obtain. She learned that Father Cristobal, the same priest who had lectured her about faith, kept a Pueblo woman as a servant, and that this service extended well beyond cooking and cleaning. The woman had borne him 2 children, both of whom had been quietly sent away to be raised in distant missions. And she learned about Doña Teresa de Aguilar. Doña Teresa was the governor's wife, a woman of extraordinary beauty, and even more extraordinary cruelty. She held salons in the governor's palace, gatherings where the colony's elite would discuss poetry, music, and philosophy, while being served elaborate meals that could have fed a dozen families like Maria's. Doña Teresa had a particular fondness for fine things, jewelry, fabrics, and especially hair. She makes wigs from it, Don Rodrigo explained one evening, drunk on aguardiente as Maria cleared away his dinner dishes. Indian hair mostly, black and straight, but yours, he laughed, a wet, unpleasant sound. Yours was exceptional. I sold it to her for 50 reales. Maria's hands stilled on the plates. 50 reales, 10 times what he'd paid her. She was delighted. Don Rodrigo continued, oblivious to the fury building behind Maria's careful mask. Said it was the finest quality she'd seen. She's having it fashioned into a hairpiece for a ball she's planning. Something elaborate, I gather. The governor's been authorized to host the Viceroy's representative this winter, and Doña Teresa wants to make an impression. Maria said nothing. She finished clearing the table, accepted her wage of half a real for the day's work, and walked home through streets that suddenly seemed sharper, more defined, as if she'd been given new eyes. 50 reales. For her hair. For the thing she'd sold out of desperation for 1/10 of its value. That night. She didn't sleep. She sat in her dark room, thinking, planning, feeling the shape of her revenge take form like clay beneath a potter's hands. Getting close to Doña Teresa required careful strategy. Maria couldn't simply approach the governor's wife directly. A beggar woman would be turned away without a second thought. She needed an introduction, a reason to be noticed, a way to make herself valuable. The opportunity came through an unexpected source. Padre Juan, one of the younger Franciscan friars. Unlike Father Cristobal, Padre Juan actually seemed to care about the spiritual welfare of his charges. He'd arrived in Santa Fe only 6 months earlier, fresh from the seminary in Mexico City, full of idealism that hadn't yet been crushed by the realities of colonial life. He preached about charity, about justice, about Christ's love for the poor and dispossessed. Maria began attending his masses. She came early and stayed late, making herself present but not obtrusive. She learned to time her arrivals so that Padre Juan would see her praying alone in the shadows, her butchered hair covered by a threadbare mantilla. She made sure he noticed when she gave her last half-real to the church's alms box, even though it meant going hungry for 2 days. It took 3 weeks, but eventually he approached her. "My child," he said gently, finding her kneeling before a statue of the Virgin. "I've seen you here often. Forgive me, but you seem troubled. Is there anything I can do to help?" Maria looked up at him with carefully crafted desperation. "Father, I'm ashamed to ask, but I have nowhere else to turn." She told him a version of her story, carefully edited. An orphan, alone in the world, struggling to survive with honest work, but finding all doors closed to her. She mentioned selling her hair, lifting her mantilla slightly so he could see the shorn remnants, but said nothing about Don Rodrigo's exploitation. Instead, she spoke of her desire to serve, to find meaningful work, to contribute something to the community that had been her home all her life. Padre Juan listened with the intensity of someone who genuinely wanted to help. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I may know of something," he said finally. "Doña Teresa de Aguilar has been looking for a new servant. Her previous girl married and moved to one of the outlying ranchos. The position doesn't pay much, but it includes room and board, and Doña Teresa, for all her particular ways, is not an unkind mistress to those who serve her well. Maria's heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral. Do you truly think she would consider me, Father? I have no references, no family to speak for me. You have me, Padre Juan said firmly. I'll speak to her. Tell her of your devotion, your humility, your willingness to work. Whether she accepts you is in God's hands. But I'll do what I can. 3 days later, Maria stood in the governor's palace for the first time. The building was grand by Santa Fe's modest standards, a sprawling adobe structure with multiple rooms arranged around a central courtyard. Doña Teresa received her in a sitting room, decorated with luxuries that must have cost a fortune to transport from Mexico City. Carved wooden furniture, silk cushions, paintings in gilded frames. And there, seated in a high-backed chair, like a queen on a throne, was the woman herself. Doña Teresa was perhaps 35, with the kind of beauty that required constant maintenance. Her skin was powdered pale, her lips rouged, her dress an elaborate construction of brocade and lace. But it was her hair that drew Maria's attention, piled high in an ornate style, augmented with what could only be hairpieces, dark, lustrous hairpieces that might have included Maria's own shorn locks. So you're the poor orphan Padre Juan told me about, Doña Teresa said, her voice cool and appraising. Turn around. Maria obeyed, letting the woman examine her like a horse at market. You're thin. Can you work? Yes, Doña Teresa. You understand the position. You'll serve as my personal maid. That means dressing me, arranging my hair, attending to my wardrobe, accompanying me when I go out. You'll sleep in the servants' quarters and take your meals in the kitchen. You'll speak only when spoken to, and you'll never, ever repeat anything you hear within these walls. Do you understand? Yes, Doña Teresa. Your hair is atrocious. We'll need to do something about that. I can't have you looking like a shorn sheep while you're attending me. She paused, considering. Actually, the shortness might work to our advantage. We can style it in the French manner, close to the head. It's becoming fashionable in Madrid, I'm told. We'll need to clean you up, of course. Get you proper clothing. You'll be a reflection of me, and I have standards. Maria lowered her eyes submissively. You're too kind, Doña Teresa. Kind, the woman laughed, a sound like breaking glass. I'm not kind, girl. I'm practical. Good servants are hard to find in this God-forsaken place, and Padre Juan seems to think you'll be loyal. Prove him right, and you'll eat regularly and sleep under a sound roof. Disappoint me, and you'll be back in whatever hovel you crawled out of. Those are the terms. Do you accept? Yes, Doña Teresa, thank you. Good. Maria, was it? Maria Josefa, Doña Teresa. Just Maria. I had a dog once named Josefa, and I won't call my maid by a dog's name. Go with Constanza, she's the housekeeper, and get yourself cleaned up. You start tomorrow. And just like that, Maria was inside. The first weeks in the governor's palace were a study in patience. Maria learned quickly that life among the colony's elite was governed by elaborate rules and rituals. Doña Teresa rose late, took her morning chocolate in bed, and spent hours on her toilette. Maria's duties included laying out clothing, heating, water for washing, and most importantly, arranging Doña Teresa's hair. This last task required the most skill. Doña Teresa's natural hair was thinning. Maria noticed it immediately, and the elaborate styles she favored depended heavily on hair pieces. There were 3 of them, stored in special boxes lined with silk. One was made from Indian hair, coarse and black. Another was Spanish hair, brown and fine. And the third? The third was Maria's. She recognized it immediately the first time Doña Teresa ordered her to fetch it. The texture, the slight wave, the precise shade of black that had been hers since childhood. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted it from its box, but she forced herself to remain calm. "That's the finest piece," Doña Teresa said, watching her in the mirror. "Cost me a fortune, but worth every real. We'll use it for the ball next month. The Viceroy's representative must see that we're civilized here, despite the primitive conditions." Maria carefully pinned the hairpiece into place, weaving it seamlessly with Doña Teresa's natural hair. The woman preened at her reflection, turning her head this way and that. "You have good hands," she said approvingly. "Steady. Constanza was always too rough. I think you'll work out well, Maria." "Thank you, Doña Teresa." As the days passed, Maria learned to navigate the palace's complex social dynamics. The governor himself was rarely present, spending most of his time dealing with the endless conflicts that plagued the colony. When he was home, he was brusque and preoccupied, barely noticing the servants who moved through his household like shadows. The other servants were a mixed group: Spanish colonists like Constanza, the housekeeper who ruled the domestic sphere with iron discipline, Pueblo Indians who did the heavy labor and field work, and mestizos who occupied an uncertain middle ground. Maria was careful with all of them, friendly but not too familiar, helpful but not obsequious. She needed them to see her as harmless, forgettable. She also paid careful attention to the palace's routines and security. She learned when the guards changed shifts, which doors were locked at night, where valuables were stored. She memorized the layout of every room she was allowed to enter, and made careful note of those she wasn't. Most importantly, she listened. Doña Teresa, like Don Rodrigo, seemed to forget that servants had ears. She entertained constantly, elaborate luncheons, intimate suppers, afternoon salons where the wives of prominent colonists would gather to gossip and scheme. Maria served wine and sweetmeats, replenished plates, and absorbed every word. She learned that Doña Teresa was deeply involved in her husband's political machinations. The governor's dispute with the Franciscans wasn't just about Indian labor. It was about power and wealth. The friars controlled access to the Pueblo villages and their resources, and the governor wanted that control for himself. Doña Teresa saw an opportunity in this conflict. If they could undermine the friars' authority and seize control of the Indian trade networks, they could become extraordinarily wealthy. She learned that Doña Teresa had expensive tastes and expensive habits. The upcoming ball wasn't just a social occasion. It was a massive expenditure designed to impress the Viceroy's representative and secure the governor's position. The costs were being passed on to the colonists through increased taxes and demands for voluntary contributions that weren't voluntary at all. And she learned that Doña Teresa had enemies. The friars, of course, despised her for supporting her husband's policies. But there were others, colonists who resented the taxes, women who envied her status, even members of her own household who chafed under her demanding nature. Constanza, the housekeeper, had served the previous governor and made no secret of her belief that the new regime was corrupt. Several of the Pueblo servants whispered among themselves in their own languages, conversations that Maria couldn't understand, but whose tone spoke of resentment and anger. Maria filed all of this information away, patient as a spider building a web. She also began her own small acts of subversion. It started with the hairpiece, her hairpiece. She was responsible for maintaining it, brushing it out after each use, storing it properly. It would have been easy to damage it, to let it tangle or mat, but that would have been too obvious. Instead, Maria was scrupulously careful with it. She treated it better than Doña Teresa's other hairpieces, which meant the woman came to rely on it more and more for important occasions. The ball was scheduled for the first week of December, timed to coincide with the representative's visit. Doña Teresa spoke of little else. She'd ordered a new gown from Mexico City, pale blue silk embroidered with silver thread. She'd commissioned new jewelry, and she designed an elaborate hairstyle that would showcase the finest hairpiece, Maria's hair, to maximum effect. "Everyone will see it," she said dreamily, as Maria brushed out the piece one afternoon. "All those pompous friars, all those provincial wives, they'll see that we're not just some backwater settlement. We have culture, refinement, taste. It will be beautiful, Doña Teresa," Maria said softly. "Yes," the woman agreed. "It will be perfect." Maria smiled and said nothing. The ball was 3 weeks away, when Maria finally learned the full extent of Doña Teresa's vanity and greed. It happened during one of the afternoon salons. Maria was serving wine when one of the guests, Doña Isabela Cortez, wife of a prominent encomendero, complimented Doña Teresa on her hair. "It's exquisite," Doña Isabela said, perhaps with more envy than admiration. "Where did you acquire such a fine piece?" Doña Teresa smiled, the expression of a cat who'd caught a particularly satisfying mouse. "From Don Rodrigo Salazar. He has connections. He can acquire unusual things." "Unusual?" Another woman, Doña Beatriz, leaned forward with interest. "How so?" "The hair is from a local girl," Doña Teresa said casually, sipping her wine. "Poor thing sold it out of desperation. Can you imagine? Being so destitute that you'd cut off your own hair and sell it like a common commodity." The women made sympathetic noises, though Maria noticed how their eyes gleamed with morbid curiosity. "What happened to her?" Doña Isabela asked. "Who knows?" Doña Teresa shrugged elegantly. "Probably starved, probably became a prostitute. That's what happens to women without protection in this place. It's tragic, really, but what can one do?" She touched the hairpiece absently. "At least her sacrifice wasn't entirely in vain. The hair is truly exceptional. I paid 50 reales for it." 50 reales, Doña Beatriz gasped. "That's a fortune." "Worth every peso," Doña Teresa assured her. "Beauty demands sacrifice. Speaking of which, you simply must see the gown I've commissioned for the ball." The conversation moved on, but Maria stood frozen by the wall, the wine pitcher trembling slightly in her hands. She'd known about the 50 reales, of course. Don Rodrigo had told her that much. But hearing Doña Teresa speak of her so casually, as if Maria had been no more than a source of raw materials, as if her desperation had been nothing more than a convenient opportunity, ignited something dark and hot in Maria's chest. Probably starved, probably became a prostitute. The words echoed in her mind that night as she lay in her narrow bed in the servants' quarters. Around her, the other maids slept, their breathing soft and even, but Maria stared at the ceiling and felt her resolve crystallize into something diamond hard. She'd been patient, she'd been careful, she'd played the role of grateful servant perfectly. But it wasn't enough to simply escape poverty by taking this position. It wasn't enough to survive. Doña Teresa needed to understand what she'd done, needed to feel the same helplessness and humiliation that Maria had felt. The woman needed to pay. The next morning, Maria woke with a plan. The final 3 weeks before the ball passed in a flurry of activity. The palace was cleaned from top to bottom. Provisions were brought in from outlying ranchos. Musicians were hired. And Doña Teresa became increasingly demanding as the pressure mounted. Maria bore it all with perfect submission. She was the ideal servant, attentive, efficient, invisible. She helped Doña Teresa perfect the elaborate hairstyle that would showcase the stolen hairpiece. She offered suggestions about makeup and jewelry. She even helped plan the seating arrangements for the banquet. But while she served, she also prepared. First, she cultivated relationships with the other servants. Not openly. That would have drawn suspicion, but through small kindnesses and shared confidences. She helped Constanza with heavy lifting when the housekeeper's back ached. She shared her meager extra food with the Pueblo servants. She listened to their complaints and validated their frustrations without ever explicitly encouraging rebellion. She paid particular attention to one servant, a Pueblo woman named Popeye, who worked in the kitchens. Popeye was older, perhaps 40, and unlike the younger Indian servants who'd been raised in the missions, she remembered life before the Spanish came. She spoke her own language, practiced her own religion in secret, and harbored a deep, quiet hatred for the colonists who'd subjugated her people. Maria recognized a kindred spirit. They began meeting in the kitchen late at night, when the rest of the household was asleep. Maria would help Popeye with the next day's bread preparation, and they would talk. Slowly, carefully, Maria drew out Popeye's story, how she'd been taken from her village as a child, forced to work in the missions, beaten for speaking her own language, how she'd seen her people's religion suppressed, their sacred objects destroyed, their children taken away to be civilized. "I will leave this place one day," Pochpe said quietly, kneading dough with strong, capable hands. "When I am old and no longer useful to them, they will discard me like broken pottery. But before that happens, I will see their pride humbled." Maria understood. "Pride," she said carefully, "is their greatest weakness." Popeye looked at her with sharp, intelligent eyes. "You hate her too, the governor's wife." It wasn't a question, but Maria answered anyway. "Yes." "Good," Popeye said. "Hate is clear. Hate is honest, better than the false smiles they demand from us." They didn't discuss details. They didn't need to. An understanding passed between them, unspoken but absolute. The second part of Maria's preparation involved gathering information about the ball itself. She learned that the guest list included not just Santa Fe's elite, but also representatives from several outlying settlements, military officers, and most importantly, Padre Superior Garcia, the head of the Franciscan mission system in New Mexico. The presence of Padre Garcia was crucial to understanding the ball's true purpose. Governor Lopez de Mendizabal was essentially throwing down a gauntlet to the friars. He was demonstrating his wealth, his connections, his ability to host the viceroy's representative in style. He was showing that he didn't need the church's approval or cooperation. Doña Teresa was central to this display. She would be the visual representation of the governor's success, beautiful, elegant, refined. And her hair, augmented by Maria's stolen locks, would be the crown jewel of her appearance. Maria smiled when she thought about it. Pride. Pope had been right. It was all about pride. The third part of her preparation was the most delicate, acquiring what she needed. She began stealing small amounts of certain substances from the palace's stores. A bit of salt here, some dried herbs there, a small vial of lamp oil. Nothing that would be missed individually, but together they would serve her purpose. She also visited Don Rodrigo's trading post one last time. The merchant greeted her with surprise and a certain wariness. He'd heard, no doubt, that she'd found employment in the governor's palace. "Little sparrow," he said, his tone careful. "What brings you here? Surely you're not looking for work anymore." "I need to buy something," Maria said calmly. "Oh? And what would that be?" she told him. His eyes widened. "That's an unusual request. Dangerous even. If anyone found out I'd sold you such a thing." Maria placed 10 reales on the counter. 2 weeks' wages, saved with painstaking care. Don Rodrigo looked at the coins, then at her. Whatever he saw in her face made him swallow hard. "I don't want to know," he said finally, taking the money. "I don't want to know what you're planning, and if anyone asks, I'll deny this transaction ever happened." "Of course," Maria said. He went into his back room and returned with a small package wrapped in oilcloth. "Be careful with this. It's powerful stuff. And Maria?" He hesitated. "I may have cheated you before, but I'm not a complete monster. Whatever you're planning, just remember that revenge has consequences. Sometimes they fall on the innocent as well as the guilty." Maria took the package. "There are no innocents in this place," she said quietly. "Only the powerful and the powerless." She left without looking back. The night of the ball arrived with perfect weather, clear and cold, with stars bright enough to rival the lanterns that illuminated the palace courtyard. Maria had been working since dawn, helping prepare Doña Teresa for her moment of triumph. The blue silk gown fitted perfectly, hugging the woman's figure before flowing out in elegant folds. The jewelry, silver and turquoise, gleamed at her throat and wrists. And the hair. The hair was magnificent. Maria had outdone herself. She'd woven Doña Teresa's natural hair together with the stolen hairpiece so seamlessly that it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. The style was elaborate but not excessive. Elegant waves and curls piled artfully high, secured with silver combs and decorated with tiny white flowers. "It's perfect," Doña Teresa breathed, staring at her reflection. "Maria, you've done wonderfully, truly wonderfully. I must remember to reward you for this." "Thank you, Doña Teresa," Maria said, her voice soft and meek. "You look beautiful." "I do, don't I?" The woman turned her head, admiring herself from different angles. "This will show them, all of them. They think we're provincial, backward. But they'll see tonight that Santa Fe can match any settlement in New Spain for culture and refinement." Guests began arriving as the sun set. Maria watched from the servants' corridor as they filed into the great hall. Men in their finest clothing, women in gowns that must have cost fortunes, everyone preening and posturing and jockeying for social position. Padre Superior Garcia arrived with a delegation of friars, their simple brown robes a stark contrast to the elaborate finery around them. The old priest's face was stern, his eyes sharp and disapproving as he surveyed the excess on display. Governor Lopez de Mendizábal greeted each guest personally, playing the gracious host while his eyes constantly moved, assessing, calculating. And beside him, radiant and triumphant, stood Doña Teresa, accepting compliments on her appearance with false modesty. Maria served wine and refreshments, moving through the crowd like a ghost. She saw how the women looked at Doña Teresa, some with admiration, others with barely concealed envy. She heard their compliments, noted the way. They couldn't stop staring at her hair. "Exquisite," she heard one woman murmur. "Like something from the court in Madrid," another agreed. Doña Teresa basked in it all, her smile growing wider with each compliment. Dinner was served at 9 o'clock, an elaborate feast featuring dishes that had required days of preparation. Maria helped serve the first courses, then withdrew to the kitchen to help Popé and the other servants with the remaining preparations. In the chaos of the busy kitchen, no one noticed when Maria slipped away for a few minutes. No one saw her make her way to Doña Teresa's private chambers. No one watched as she locked the door behind her and opened the special box where the hairpiece was usually stored. She worked quickly, her hands steady despite the pounding of her heart. The package Don Rodrigo had given her contained a special resin harvested from desert plants, mixed with other substances that would create a powerful adhesive. Maria had tested it carefully over the past week, making sure she understood exactly how it worked. Applied to hair, it would create bonds impossible to remove without cutting. The affected hair would stick to skin, to fabric, to itself, becoming a tangled, painful mess. And the process would be irreversible once it set, which took approximately 3 hours. 3 hours, just long enough for the ball to reach its climax. Maria carefully applied the resin to the base of the hairpiece, where it connected to Doña Teresa's natural hair. She used just enough to ensure a thorough bond, but not so much that it would be immediately visible or feelable. The resin was designed to remain pliable for about an hour after application, which meant Doña Teresa wouldn't notice anything wrong at first. When she was satisfied with her work, Maria cleaned her hands thoroughly, replaced everything exactly as it had been, and slipped back to the kitchen. "Where were you?" Constanza demanded. "Checking on Doña Teresa's chambers," Maria lied smoothly, making sure everything was ready in case she needed to retire and refresh herself. Constanza grunted, already distracted by the next crisis. The kitchen was in chaos. Too many dishes to prepare, too many demands from the dining hall. Maria threw herself back into the work, helping wherever needed, the perfect servant. In the great hall, the feast continued. Course after course emerged from the kitchen, each more elaborate than the last. Wine flowed freely. Musicians played. The governor gave a speech praising the viceroy and expressing his loyalty to the crown. The representative responded with diplomatic pleasantries. And through it all, Doña Teresa reigned supreme, the beautiful hostess, the governor's perfect wife, her stolen hair gleaming in the candlelight. Maria watched from the servants' corridor and waited. The first sign of trouble came about 90 minutes into the feast. Maria was in the kitchen when Constanza received an urgent summons from Doña Teresa. The message was terse. Something was wrong with her hair, and she needed Maria immediately. Maria took her time walking to Doña Teresa's chambers, counting her steps, letting the seconds tick by. Every moment that passed allowed the resin to set more firmly. She found Doña Teresa standing before her mirror, her face pale with mounting panic. "My hair," the woman said, her voice tight. "Something's wrong. It feels strange, stiff, and I can't seem to adjust it." Maria approached calmly. "Let me see, Doña Teresa." She made a show of examining the elaborate hairstyle, gently touching the places where she knew the resin was setting. Doña Teresa winced. "It hurts," she said. "When you touch it, it pulls." "What's happening?" "Perhaps the pins are too tight," Maria suggested. "Let me try to loosen them." She pretended to work on the pins,